Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharon Troy. I'm the Director of Public Engagement in the School of Public Affairs and Administration, and in coordination with the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center, we welcome you to our first event of the semester. This semester, the School of Public Affairs is launching a series of activities, events, panels, and presentation in preparation of the November 2020 election. As we all have been currently experiencing the impact of COVID-19, the racial reckoning in the United States, we felt that it was important to offer individuals the opportunity to hear why the power of vote is so important. So our theme this semester is the power of vote, registration, education, and awareness. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Linda McDonald Carter as our first speaker for the semester. I'm just going to read briefly. Her bio is absolutely amazing. And if you know her as an instructor, you may know a little bit about her. But I would like to just make sure I recognize and acknowledge the things that Ms. Carter has accomplished in her lifetime. Linda McDonald Carter is a lifelong resident of the city of Newark. She is the owner of the law office of Linda McDonald Carter, LLC. She has been in practice of law since 1992. Initially in her own law firm before joining with Lisa Hendricks Richardson, Rhonda Pope Stevenson, and Vanessa Williams Powell to form one of the first and largest African-American law firms in New Jersey. Linda is also a member of the Association of Black Women Lawyers of New Jersey, member of the Social Justice Committee, the Garden State Bar Association, the member of the Social Justice Task Force, New Jersey State Bar Association, New Jersey Bar Association Committee on Paralegals, New Jersey Bar Association Diversity Committee, American Bar Association Standing Committee on Paralegal, the American Association for Paralegal Education, the Essex County Bar Association, and the Paralegal Association New Jersey. It seems like she has all aspects of law covered. She also serves as the New Jersey Attorney Ethics Fee Arbitration Committee for Essex County. In March 2016, Linda was sworn into practice before the United States Supreme Court and is a member of the United Supreme Court Historical Society. In November 2016, she was elected to the position of American Association for Paralegal Educators, representing the organization with the American Bar Association. Linda completed a fellowship through the National Endowment for the Humanities, bridging historians through Latino history and culture at the Graduate Center in SUNY. Her humble beginnings started over 5 decades ago during the 1950s McCarthy era and the Civil Rights era that involved the Black Power movement. She definitely became engaged as an activist and an active citizen. She vividly recalls seeing the world through the eyes of the media and television, watching the show Perry Mason. Linda, my husband, is a Perry Mason fan to this day. Grew up in Scudder housing projects located in the Central Ward. After the rebellion of 1967, Linda vowed to become an attorney, not necessary to practice law and make money, but rather to help make a difference in her community, interpreting the language of law and providing direction on how to navigate the justice system. Linda's burning interest in the world in which we live intensified as she was introduced to new cultures, religions, and people. Throughout her experiences, she gained the appreciation and deep respect for history and the political isms. She studied political science at Rutgers University and later graduated from Rutgers University Law School in Newark. She has served professionally as resident manager living in Scudder Home Housing Project, later became a Section 8 manager in the city of Newark. She worked with Senator Bill Bradley. There was a period of time where Linda lived in Southern California where she spent time registering voters. She was involved in the registration of 800,000 California residents. She continues to serve on panels addressing a variety of numerous challenges and obstacles directly or indirectly negatively impacting communities, including youth, people of color, and the poor. Linda's community service activities are extensive and include various organizations: Vocal, the Newark History, Newark Rebellion, 1967. Remembering the Newark Rebellion, she served as the only woman panelist in that particular capacity. Linda is the eldest of 6 brothers, 2 sisters, an aunt to 19 nieces and nephews, and a grand aunt of 17. She is also the wife of a really cool husband named Aaron. As you can see in her extensive history, background, experiences, and expertise, why I felt it was our privilege for Linda McDonald Carter to talk about Black and white women suffrage in New Jersey. It is my pleasure to introduce you, Linda McDonald Carter.
Thank you, Sharon. I didn't know who you were talking about for a minute there. I'm like, wow, that's me? Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm just living my life and these things happen.
That's it. Linda, would you like me to start the PowerPoint?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much. So basically today we're going to talk about suffrage of Black and white women and voting in New Jersey. We'll also cover some information about voter suppression and a couple of other little tips I have for people. You can proceed to the next slide, Sharon. Thank you. Oh, the next one. Okay. First of all, let's start with the quote by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich: "Well-behaved women seldom make history." Next slide. New Jersey suffrage timeline. So the timelines can provide you a history of what's happened in the state of New Jersey from the 1700s up until about the 1800s, because things stopped a little bit, and then we'll get back. Next slide. Okay, did you guys know that women and African Americans could vote in New Jersey before they had the right to vote under the United States Constitution, particularly Amendments 15 and 19? Next slide. Okay. Women and African Americans can vote in New Jersey before those United States Constitution amendments. In New Jersey's first constitution was in 1776, giving the rights to all inhabitants of the colony of full age who were worthy of 50 pounds. So if you were valued at 50 pounds or more and you resided within the county for 12 months, right? So if you resided in Essex County for 12 months, you could vote. In 1790, the legislature reworded, when I said before vote, I should say males. And then later on in 1790, New Jersey legislature reworded the law to say he or she, clarifying that both men and women had the right to vote. But married women, because they were considered property and couldn't own property, they couldn't vote. But single women in New Jersey could vote. African Americans in the state of New Jersey could vote if they met the residency property requirements, as I mentioned before. In 1797, the New Jersey government required voters to be free inhabitants. We do not know if enslaved African Americans voted before that law passed, but because the property requirements made it unlikely, but no law specifically prohibited them from doing so. So this is even before the 14th and 15th Amendment. Then New Jersey was very progressive and they allowed people to vote. Next slide. Okay, so here we have a timeline of voting in New Jersey. So in 1776, New Jersey Constitution allows women and free Blacks, it should be Black people, but you know, people do that, to vote under certain conditions. In 1790, the law passage was used the term he or she, referring to voters so that men and women could vote. And again, women couldn't vote because, married women couldn't vote because they couldn't own property, but men could own property. In 1797, voting laws revised. The law still refers to he and she, so women can continue to vote. In 1800, New Jersey women vote for presidential elections, during the presidential election in 1800. In 1807, the voting laws are now changed to limit voting to just free white men. In 1844, The second New Jersey Constitution limits voting to free white males. And then it goes on. In 1857, Lucy Stone refuses to pay her property taxes in Orange, New Jersey, claiming that if I can't vote, I'm not going to pay my taxes. In 1867, you have New Jersey, NJWSA, was founded by Lucy Stone. In 1868, Lucy Stone publishes a pamphlet, The Reasons Why the Women of New Jersey Should Be Able to Vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony attend that meeting in Vineland, New Jersey. And New Jersey women petitioned the state legislators, that would be your state senators and your state assembly people, to get the right to vote. In 1869, the 15th Amendment of the Constitution is ratified, and it gives Black men the right to vote. So prior to that, other than what's happening in Jersey, in this country, at that time, you can only vote if you were, first of all, a white man who owned property. And chances are, if you own property, you own Black people. But if you were a poor white person, you could vote later on. And then the 15th Amendment came so that Black men can vote. So this becomes some tension historically, and you'll find it out in your classes or whatever. I'm talking to my students by accident, guys. But you find out that while you had the right to vote as a Black man, that wasn't all it took for you to be able to vote. So in 1869, you also have the Equal Rights Association splinters over the strategy and tactics, and the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Associations are formed. Memorial to New Jersey legislated by New Jersey Women's Suffrage and Women's Rights. In 1873, women are eligible to serve as school trustees. That means these are the people who serve and make decisions about schools, the policies and things associated with schools. As a matter of fact, I can tell you about that time in Newark in particular, you have the first colored school, which is interesting. Even though women cannot vote in school trustee elections, they could actually serve as trustees. In 1876, you have the New Jersey Women's Christian Temperance Union organized in Trenton, New Jersey. 1880, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she's still around, and she tries to vote in, I think, Tenafly, New Jersey. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Karen. In 1884, New Jersey women petitioned New Jersey legislature for full suffrage for women to be able to vote. Remember, this is maybe 20, almost 30 years before the 19th Amendment is passed. They're doing a lot of groundwork, a lot of organizing, but they're very determined that they're going to vote. 1887, the legislature passes laws giving women the right to vote in school elections. So women in New Jersey can vote in school elections in 1887. 1880, the NJWSA elects Judge John Whitehead as the president, a man, to be the president of the organization. 1891, Antoinette Brown Bucknell becomes president of the organization. 1892, Amelia Dickinson Pope becomes president. 1893, Florence Ho Hall becomes president and remains in that position to 1996. In 1894, in Allison versus Blake, the New Jersey Supreme Court decided that it's unconstitutional for women to vote in school elections, though a later decision allows that they can vote on school appropriations. So they can't vote on the elections of who's going to be there, but they can vote on the budgets for schools, and that's important. In 1897, a vote that would have allowed women to vote in school elections was defeated by 10,000 out of 140,000 votes. 1900, Manola Graham Sexton is elected president of that organization. 1901, Josephine Silo Yates of Metlack, New Jersey, becomes president of the organization. 1905, there's no leader. 1908, Clara Laddie becomes president. The Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, later renamed the Women's Political Union, formed and focused on generating support from both Republicans and Democrats. 1910, Equal Franchise Society founded in Hoboken, New Jersey. And then later there's a men's league for suffrage established in Newark, New Jersey. I think this is the next one. Next slide. I'm sorry, Sharon. All right. There's a resolution in favor of women voting, first introduced in New Jersey Senate. 3 years later, it's passed by both houses. That's the Assembly and the State Senate in New Jersey. 1912, Lillian Ford Beckgard becomes president of the organization. You have a case, Carpenter versus Cornish, heard before the New Jersey Supreme Court of Appeals. The argument is that the 1844 Constitution was illegal in taking away rights granted by the Constitution in 1776 that allowed women to vote. 1913, the Democrats and the Republican parties endorsed women's suffrage because they're trying to get their vote. Major suffrage groups meet with Woodrow Wilson, who was from New Jersey, who was former president of Princeton University and later became the president of the United States. He offers a vague endorsement because, you know, they're thinking now people are not crazy. Like all these women coming to the vote, we need to be able to get their vote, determine which of our parties are going to win. 1914, men's anti-suffrage. These are men that are against women having the right to vote. 1914. Also in 1914, New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage is founded. And these are women opposed to women's right to vote. And then Grace Baxter Fenderser of New Jersey helps to fund the NAACP, which supports female voting rights. So the NAACP actually jumps on this in 1914. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson comes out in support as a private citizen, but not as a president. And this is 2 weeks before the vote. In New Jersey, referendums is what you pull on the ballot and people go, and when you vote, or if you've already voted and put your ballot in, you'll see that there may be certain things on the ballot in addition to individuals running for office. And that's what they're referring to here. New Jersey referendum in public section, in a public election, which was lost, the vote was 51,000 to 317,000. So that referendum was defeated. In 1915, Reverend Florence Sparing Randolph organizes New Jersey State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, branch of the Congressional Union, organized New Jersey with Allison Turnbull Hopkins as the president. Then you have the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs defeated a suffrage resolution. So now all the women are really supporting this. 1916, National Women's Party forms a chapter in New Jersey with Allison Hopkins as president. 1917, New Jersey women are among those arrested in front of the White House because they were protesting, trying to get the right to vote. So this whole thing about protesting is not a new thing. It's been happening in this country all the way back to the Boston Tea Party. The Equal Franchise Society and the Women's Political Union both vote to disband and merge with, this is part of the politics of the organization. I believe this is last slide coming up, Sharon. And then you have, in 1918, Republican Governor Walter Edge was for women voting. And then by now, this organization, NJWSA, has a membership of 120,000 women. And then in 1920, New Jersey is the 29th state to ratify the 19th Amendment that gives women throughout the country the right to vote. And you know, I will say as we go on that it wasn't clear that Black women can vote then. Chances are, because you have Jim Crow and you had Black codes, there were a lot of things that were happening that would discourage them, even though it's not really clear they could or could not vote then. Okay, Sharon, thank you. We can move on. All right, so I'm gonna go through these quickly and you'll come back and see it. So you have the 14th Amendment. For all intent and purposes, the 14th Amendment, to make it simple, means that anything that applies to the United States government also applies to the states. So if the United States government, the federal government, you remember we have the federal and state system, if the federal government allows you to vote, then the 14th Amendment says the states have to give you that same right. Go ahead, you can move on. Sharon, you can go ahead. The 15th Amendment basically says that you have the right to vote and you cannot be denied the right to vote because of your race. Even though this provides for Black men to be able to vote, it doesn't guarantee them the right to vote. It says we can vote, but the problem is the states control what the process is going to be and what the conditions are going to be in order to vote. And that's something that we're struggling with today in 2020. Okay, Sharon. Okay. And then, as you know, I mentioned earlier, you had the 19th Amendment, which is, we're celebrating exactly this year, 100 years of women's right to vote. Now, this is white women's right to vote. Even though Black women helped with it, they weren't quite, it's not clear that they were able to vote. It didn't become clear that they really can vote until later on in 1965. So the 19th Amendment, basically, as you can see, it said you can vote, you should not be denied the right to vote because of your sex, primarily female. Okay, Shane. All right. And then, as I said before, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You see the difference? 1920 to 19, that's 44 years before it's very clear that Black women can vote in this country. Now, think about it. That kind of questions whether or not they're actually citizens of this country, because being a citizen means you should have a right to vote. And I will mention that one of the things is that even though we talk about voting in this country, we talk a good game. What we say and what we do is different. You know, people argue that you should have the right to vote when you're born in the United States. So it's really interesting that we have this struggle going on, not only to get the right to vote, but to also to hold the right to vote. Okay. So, you know, basically in 1964, that gives Black women the right to vote. So by 1964, everyone has the right to vote, but still the states can determine whether or not you meet the requirements to vote. Okay, Shannon. Next slide. Okay. As an aside, I just want you to know that the first Black person in America to vote was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Mundy Peterson. He was the first Black man in the United States to vote in an election after the enactment of the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the opportunity, the right to vote, the constitutional right to vote. And Peterson cast his historic vote on March 31st, 1870. And his iconic vote was cast in a local election in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And it was for the town's charter. You know, when you guys are doing program summaries in my class, they do program summaries, a way to teach them media literacy and discerning what's press versus media. And the charter is like the mission for a program. The charter would be the mission for that town. In an interview with Mr. Peterson, he said he was encouraged. He said, he was encouraged to vote. He said, I was working for Mr. T.L. Kearney on the morning of the day of election, and he did not think of voting until he came out to the stable where he was attending to horses, and Mr. Kearney, advised him to go to the polls and exercise a citizen's privilege. So the person that he worked for actually encouraged him to vote. Next slide. Okay. This is Susan B. Anthony. Some of you may have coins at home. If you do, keep that coin because it could be valuable. She actually, in her quest to vote, she went on to vote and she was actually arrested. And that was a major case where it was on appeal. There were a lot of things involved. As a matter of fact, I understand that President Trump just pardoned her. Not something that I think she would have wanted. And from what I've read, she really wouldn't want to be pardoned. She wanted people to know that she had to go to court and spend money in order to be able to exercise her right to vote. Next slide. All right. As a result of all the work, all the work has been done since 1700s in the state of New Jersey, I wanted to just show people some of the individuals who benefited from that later on. As soon as a year later, Margaret Lard and Jenny Van Ness became, and they were both Republicans, became the first two women elected to the New Jersey Assembly. That's only 1 year after women get the right to vote. In 1925, Rebecca Estelle Bourgeois-Z Winston, who was a Democrat, of Estelle Manor, became the first woman to serve as a mayor in New Jersey. Next slide. Mary Teresa Norton, a Democrat, that's where they put R or D, became the first woman to represent New Jersey in Congress, serving in the U.S. House of Representatives for a sizable time, for 26 years. To date, no woman has yet to represent New Jersey in the United States Senate. So I guess one of my students in the audience is going to have to run to be a United States Senator to represent New Jersey. 1957.
Citizens are allowed?
Well, we'll see.
For Senate?
United States Senate. Okay. 1957, Madeline A. Worthy Williams, a Democrat, becomes the first Black woman elected to New Jersey Assembly. In 1965, Marion West Higgins, Republican, became the first woman Speaker of New Jersey Assembly, was the third woman in the country to be the Speaker of a state house. Next slide. Mildred Berry Hughes became the first woman elected to the New Jersey Senate. Winona Littman became the first Black woman elected to a county freeholder board in New Jersey, right here in Essex County, right across the street from Essex County College. And as a matter of fact, they have sizable interest in what kind of money the college is going to get. And she's the first Black woman to serve in New Jersey Senate. She was also, when I came back from California, I worked for Winona Littman. So I had the privilege of working for her. Next slide. Marie Garibaldi became the first woman to serve on New Jersey Supreme Court. And that's not that that was an elected position. It was the fact that because of the pressure that women can put on elected officials, that, you know, people consider women in positions they had not considered them for before. Nadia DeVilliers Colon became the first Latino elected to a county freeholder board. And the county, you have the city and then the county. And we didn't always have counties, but freeholder, and I understand that term has been changed because freeholder meant somebody who owned property, and more than likely they owned chattel slaves. And let me just stop for a minute and explain why I say chattel slaves and slave. Chattel meant you were property. So that the difference would be if you were a slave, you were considered human. But if you're a chattel slave, you're considered property. And that's a big difference between one where people have control of your life, but they still treat you as a human. Whereas in the other situation, they consider you to be less than human. Teresa Ruiz became the first Latino to serve in New Jersey Senate. And I see Teresa all the time. Next. Oh, Sharon, next one. Sheila Oliver became the first woman of color and the second woman to serve as Speaker of New Jersey Assembly. She was the second Black woman in the nation to serve as the Speaker of the lower house. And right now she serves with the governor of New Jersey. She is the, I can't think of the position right now. I'm having a
Lieutenant Governor.
Lieutenant Governor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mildred Scott became the first Black woman elected county sheriff in New Jersey, as well as the first woman elected sheriff in Middlesex County at all. And I know Sheila, we run into each other all the time. Bernice Bass, WNJR-AM, that was the FM station. And I have to tell you that that was AM station, I'm sorry. FM stations, a lot of people didn't listen to FM stations, but she was AM. And I didn't get a chance to meet her, but I actually would hear her on Sunday night. And she was someone who would make elected officials accountable. Every Sunday night, everybody, all the politicians would go and listen to her program because they were afraid she was going to mention them. And she would blast them. If they weren't doing the right thing, she would let everybody know on her radio program. Carol Graves, who actually has, I have a relationship where she's like a ex-in-law. She was the first Black woman in charge of the Newark Teachers Union. As a matter of fact, when I was in school, she was the head of the Teachers Union in Newark. Mildred Crump, the first Black female councilwoman in Newark. Mildred, actually, when they were planning for Mildred to run, we were meeting in one of my friends' homes. And I think earlier Sharon mentioned that I was a member of the largest Black women law firm in the country in the history. And it's still not enough of us. But I remember planning for Mildred to run for this position. We were sitting in my girlfriend's house. Everybody, I think it was like a Sunday, and we would plan on Mildred, you know, how we're going to get her to be a council person. So that was like years ago. Gail Cheneyfield, first woman council person in the Central Ward of Newark, where I lived most of my life, but she was not, I don't think she was born when I was living in the projects, but she actually married somebody that I babysat. She married Kevin Jenkins, and I used to babysit Kevin. Kevin was one of the few, my first jobs when I was 12, I used to do babysitting jobs. And her husband, see, I have connections with a lot of these people. I didn't realize until I started seeing their pictures. Okay, Sharon. Connie Woodruff, she was another person. She didn't exactly run for office, but Connie was with Essex County College, and she was another one. When politicians saw Connie, they knew they had to do the right thing. So there's a lot of power that we have when they know that you know what your power is. Marie Villani was the first female Newark City Council person. She was not elected. What happened? Her husband was the council person, and when she died, she was appointed. When he died, she was appointed to his position, so she wasn't elected. Actually, Susan King has nothing to do with this. She got left here, but since she's here, I'll just tell you that there would not be military pensions for Black soldiers or any soldiers if it wasn't for her. So, you know, if you have a family member in the military and you have a pension, you need to thank Susie King. Okay, next slide. All right, so now I'm going to talk about voter suppression because it's not new. A lot of people have heard of it recently. Both parties participate in it in different ways, but it's something that is been in the United States throughout our history. And so the timeline for voter suppression in the United States goes from the Civil War to today. You have poll taxes that continue today in the 20th century. And more recently, some of you heard the case in Florida with regard to people who have been formerly incarcerated. And I will just tell you as an aside, the gentleman who led that effort actually, when he came out of prison, he actually served time in prison. And when he came out, he was going to commit suicide. And he was all ready to kill himself. And then he realized that if he killed himself, nobody would come to his funeral. So he said, well, let me start doing things so that I can have more people come to my funeral. And he ended up where now he managed to get a vote in the state of Florida where about 65% of the people in Florida who voted for people who come out of prison who were formerly incarcerated to be able to vote, have the right to vote, and participate in the voter franchise. So he went from, which is amazing, he went from about to commit suicide to actually creating a situation that opened the door for thousands of people to be able to engage in the suffrage, to be able to vote. Unfortunately, the Congress, not the Congress, but the Florida legislators actually passed a law, which today, that would be considered today's poll tax. And the law is that before you can vote, they've required that these people actually pay whatever fines they owe. And I know more recently, in the last couple of weeks, I understand former mayor of New York, Bloomberg, who's actually a multi-billionaire, has sought to cover and to get rid of the poll tax and to get rid of their fines to pay them off. But I understand there's some investigations going on because people are not happy about having thousands of people who are formerly incarcerated vote, because if they do, they're going to look to vote for people who are going to support the issues that impact them. And not everybody wants to be able to do that. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Sharon. All right, so the ongoing fight to overcome voter suppression. Well, the whole concept of voter suppression goes back about 150 years. We're celebrating the 150-year anniversary of the 15th Amendment. And the right to, the fight to vote has been going on about that long. As I said before, it allows Black Americans to vote, particularly Black men, because we know now that Black women couldn't vote. Today, Black voters across the country, however, are still encountering roadblocks, which I talked about in Florida. Voter suppression has been part of the United States political scene since the nation's inception, from Jim Crow laws to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for citizens of the United States, particularly communities of color, have been disenfranchised in blatant and also in subtle ways, which I talked about. Both of the major parties have to some degree been involved in this. And now with the 2020 election between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, you know, obviously this was done a while ago because a lot of things have happened in the last 3 months. But this whole concept of deterring people from voting, primarily Black Americans and other people of color, is still at the forefront. Next slide. Okay. It's important to acknowledge that it has always, or almost for the entire history of the country, been about race, all right? Because chattel slavery is at the heart of basically all the issues we have in this country. You know, from a, I guess in terms of, from a finance point of view, you know, when you had a group of people who were doing labor for free, and now they're no longer doing labor for free, that becomes a problem, because now people have to pay for things that they may not have wanted to pay for. So anyway, voter suppression has been intertwined with race, with an attempt to stop the first Black men and since then other people of color from voting. The timeline of voter suppression in the United States begins with the post-Civil War, right after the Civil War, up to today. And from reading in the paper and the news, it appears that there's some other strategies going on to really impact the vote. And I know all of you, if you haven't, for those of you who may see this tape later on, I'm sure there'll be so many things in the news that you'll see along the way that demonstrate that we have an ongoing problem with voter suppression. Next slide. Oh, let me just go back for a second. Go back for a second, Sharon, I'm sorry. On the left-hand side where you see African-American voters placing a ballot, a paper ballot in a steel box on a table manned by voter registration workers while a police officer stands guard on election day of the public school building. And this is in Harlem. This is something that's happened today. You have people who are vigilantes, people say, or maybe police, other people who are using their positions to intimidate people, to discourage them. And the other part, you know, because I saw this as 1944, it reminded me, if you know where University of Medicine and Dentistry is, you know the history. University of Medicine, actually, the site of University of Medicine and Dentistry was determined because the governor wanted to get rid of the middle-class Black people who lived in the area. And this was all the Central Ward. In the Central Ward, you had pharmacists, doctors, lawyers. You had people from poor people, which was a different kind of poor at the time. Working class people, people working in factories, people cleaning folks' homes. You had the pharmacists up the street. So you had a mix of people in the Central Ward. But at that time, since they could vote, the governor didn't think they were going to vote for him. So what he did is he dedicated that land to University of Medicine and Dentistry. And what happened, you ended up, all of those individuals had to move from their property. Many of them, they call it eminent domain. They were given some money for it, but for the most part, they were forced out. It was a way to keep them from voting against the governor. And that's why University of Medicine and Dentistry is located at this site. I will tell you, there's a gentleman by the name of Junius Williams, who actually has a memorandum that was done a while ago that says that, well, since those people have given up that land so that University of Medicine and Dentistry could be built there, that that hospital should always serve the community. And if it stops serving the community, are you going to give back the land to the individuals who were there that you forced them out in order to keep them from voting? So, you know, voting is really important. Next slide, Sharon. Thank you. All right. Again, this is just a repeat of what I talked about. After the Civil War, there were three crucial amendments to the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery and indentured servitude. I will tell you that this applies except for people who are incarcerated. They can be treated as slaves. The 14th Amendment, which we talked about, equal protection under the law, basically says whatever rights you have under the federal Constitution, you also have under the state Constitution. However, it wasn't until the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870, that states were prohibited from preventing voters on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude from voting. And then the 15th Amendment, which I mentioned earlier, primarily gave, in effect, Black men the right to vote, right? Black men the right to vote. Tennessee was the last state to formally ratify. And now this is to ratify the 15th Amendment that was done in the 1800s. Tennessee didn't agree to it to 1997, right? You're talking about 1870, and not until 1970, which is how many years? That's almost 120 years later, right? That the state ratifies. Voting rights were also denied for those convicted of crimes through felon disenfranchisement. I can't get out, disenfranchisement laws, which basically means that if you were in prison, then you couldn't vote. Your right to be a citizen is taken away because you served time in prison. Next slide, thanks. This is just an example of a sheriff standing, again, intimidating people who desperately want to vote. He's smoking a pipe in front of a crowd of voting registrants. This is in Mississippi in 1946. Now, by 1870, there were 28 states who adopted a version of these laws that would prevent people who are convicted of felons the right to vote. So basically what you're saying is that once I go, if I'm convicted of a felony, my citizenship in this country has been taken away. Southern states also enforce rules commonly known as the Jim Crow laws, which mandated segregation in places, meaning that you had the separate fountains, everything was separate, the schools were separate, everything was separate, particularly between white and Black Americans. And whenever I'm looking now and it says white and it should be a capital letter, because I understand in English, the rules of English are whenever you're referring to a group of people, particularly regarding their race, it should be capitalized. And then the poll tax was one of the Jim Crow laws to prohibit people from voting. Next slide, Sharon. Thank you. Okay, poll taxes. Poll tax, a way to keep people from voting, to discourage those who could not afford to pay. Now let's go back to the Florida case. If you're coming, you serve time in prison, you don't have a job, and you have to pay fines, they're basically saying that you got to pay the fines in order for you to vote. Well, this is not new. Poll taxes, a way of voter suppression. If you could not afford to pay to vote, and all of you in this audience, you have an opportunity to do it and you don't have to pay. That was a prerequisite to register to vote in Jim Crow states. Poll taxes disproportionately affected Black voters, who were a large population in the South: Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and a host of other states. Poll tax continue, as I mentioned earlier, excuse me, they continue, and the Florida case is the best example. Excuse me. Next slide. Literacy tests was another way to keep people from voting. It was implemented to stop those who were uneducated, right, from participating in the voting process. Literacy tests were administered at the discretion of those in charge of voter registration. So if you go to vote now, well, not necessarily because of COVID, so you might decide to do it another way. But if you voted before, you would get up there to vote and somebody would say, okay, I want you to read this. Now, that's a problem, because most people coming out of chattel slavery did not know how to read. They were not allowed to read. You could get beaten, almost beaten to death for trying to read the Bible. And they would bring everybody around, so as a way to discourage people from reading, they would bring all the chattel slaves around to see you get beaten for trying to read the Bible, to make sure that they don't try to read the Bible later on. So literacy tests were administered at the discretion. That means they could decide if they wanted to or not to give you this test. The test asks civics questions, and all of you have a chance to learn civics without having somebody test you, as in which documents, tests asking civics questions such as, in which document or writing is the Bill of Rights found? Or name two of the purposes of the United States Constitution. Well, if you can't read, how can you answer that question? And that was a way to keep people from voting. Next slide, thank you. Grandfather clause. White men who could not pass the literacy test because they couldn't read. A lot of poor white men couldn't read either. And however, they were able to vote because all they had to do was show that they were allowed to vote, to participate in voting, because their grandfathers could vote in 1867. In 1867, we were just coming out of slavery. So, most Black people couldn't vote because their grandfathers weren't able to vote before 1867. So the grandfather clause was ruled unconstitutional in 1915. That's just the grandfather clause. Poll taxes were abolished in 1964, right? Poll taxes abolished. Look how many years later this is happening. And with the 25th Amendment, and literacy tests were outlawed under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Look how long it takes, right? And so we're supposed to be a country that encourages people to participate as citizens in the process, but we did all of these different things to discourage a group of people from voting. Next slide. Okay, then you have women's suffrage, which we talked about earlier. Before the Voting Rights in 1965, the 19th Amendment was the first amendment that assured women the right to vote. I'm pretty much repeating that. However, when ratified 100 years later, it did not guarantee. Remember I said earlier, it wasn't clear that Black women could or could not vote, but they were discouraged from voting. But by 1965, they get the right to vote. And that's not been that long ago. I know many of you weren't born, but 1965 wasn't really that long ago. Next slide, Sharon. All right. Even though theoretically, as I said, women, Black women, for example, should have had the right to vote under the provisions as practical matter, we know that certainly was not the case and remains not a fully realized reality for many Black women and women of color in this country. And you can see the Phyllis Wheatley Club. Some of you, if you know anything about Black history, you know about Phyllis Wheatley. She actually wrote as a chattel slave in the 1700s. And so a lot of things that happen, you know, these women create their own organizations. Next slide. Okay, gutting of the Voting Rights Act. Well, first of all, you have the Vietnam War, and that's where I grew up during that period of time. As a matter of fact, I'm probably so passionate about voting and being a citizen and knowing about politics and American government because in 1972, what happened in Central High School is that all of us who are going to turn 18 were going to be able to vote in that November. So what they did at the high school, they actually, it was like a very special ceremony. We actually walked across the stage to register to vote. Everybody was in the audience, in the assembly, and we walked across the stage to be able to vote. And that was like a really big deal. Basically what had happened is that people had decided that if young men could go to war and die, they should be able to participate in the process and not wait till they were 21. So the 26th Amendment of the Constitution during the 26th Amendment actually was ratified during the Vietnam War to allow more men and women across the country to register to vote. But that was a really big deal. And I told people that I've not missed one election, and New Jersey has a lot of them, since 1972. Next slide. All right. I actually participated in the Motor Voter Act. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, commonly known as the Motor Voter Act, was intended to offer more opportunities for voters to become registered by making Department of Motor Vehicles, Public Assistance, Social Security, all the public agencies had registration forms so that people can easily get it and register to vote. It was supposed to enhance the numbers of people who would be engaged in the political process. And I had just come back from California, as a matter of fact, where, as Sharon mentioned earlier, I was involved in the registration drive that registered 800,000 people in California. Then I come back and I get a position where I worked in the motor voter law between New York and New Jersey in 1993. So, you know, I'm looking at this and saying, wow, I was actually engaged and involved in these things. And what you see in the picture are Black men and women stand in line in the rain while trying to register in a priority to take a vote registration test in Selma, Alabama. So these people, all of these people, you can look way back. You can see all these people, they're so desperate to register to vote that they're standing in the rain and they still have to take a test, but that doesn't discourage them. And it reminds me, if anybody saw any of the pictures in South Africa when Nelson Mandela ran for president, and the people who stood online just to be able to vote, it's that important. Next slide, Sharon. Thank you. And then later on, and this is an interesting case because of the politics. You know, one of the things I tell my students is that things don't just happen. You have historical content, you have protests, you have, you know, all these different things that are happening. The fact you had the first Black president actually played a role in this particular case. This is the fight to get more people to vote, and the progress after the Voting Rights Act came to a halt after 2013. In the United States Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder. Holder was the attorney general who brought the case under the President Barack Obama's administration. And it changed the way the Voting Rights Act was implemented nationwide. In a 5-4 decision, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which was just passed in the 1960s, right? That's not that long ago. This is 2013. That was in 1965, the Voting Rights Act came into effect. But the Voting Rights Act was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court that year. While Jim Crow laws were banned nationwide because of the act, the floodgates were open to allow states across the country to implement massive dents in the voting infrastructure in the United States. So in other words, it really, it opened the doors where now we're having people go back to some of the same things they were doing during the Jim Crow era in terms of preventing people from voting. The other thing is that it just so happens that at that time, I think we were supposed to be in a race neutral state of being here in the United States at that time because we had a Black president. And there were people who basically said, well, we don't have to pay attention to what's happening in terms of voting rights because you got a Black president now, so everything should be okay. Next. All right, references, you can move past that. That was, you know. All right, I wanted to play this because I thought this was really important. Sharon, if you would hit his name. At the
How
top.
long is the video?
3 minutes, about 4 minutes.
Okay.
Adam Clayton Powell was the second, let me just hold on a sec. He was the second Black congressperson after Reconstruction. After Reconstruction ended, I should say. And you would notice how light he is. He's actually a Black Puerto Rican. But I will tell you that he was approached by people who said, you know, and I should go back a little bit and talk about when people were really light-skinned Black people, like really light Black people, if it had been so horrible to be a Black person in the United States that many people took the opportunity, if they were light enough, to pass over and pretend that they were white. And he went to Colgate University, and many of the Black students that he went to school with actually came to him and said, are you gonna leave us and cross over? He said no. And he's the only elected official I know of in the history of the United States, Black or white, who was willing to die for the people he represented. So on that note, I wanted you to hear this piece, What's in Your Hand, by Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. You can just hit his name, Sharon, that's fine. Oh, you may have to.
You can't hear it?
No, you got to put the sound on for the share.
All right, give me a second.
Okay.
How many, Linda, how many more slides?
It's just one after this.
Oh yeah, here's the sound. Okay.
That's why I'm working hard to get this surplus food here. Some of you say to me, well, I'm not like you. I'm not a congressman. I haven't got education. I haven't got work. But you're a human being. And you know what you've got? You've got in your hand the power to use your vote and to use even those few cents you get from welfare to spend them only where you want to spend them. A young slave boy stood one day before the greatest ruler of his day. And God said to Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses said, Lord, only I've got a stick, that's all. He said, well, let me use what's in your hand. And God used that slave boy with a stick in his hand to divide the Red Seas, march through a wilderness, bring water out of rocks, manna from heaven, and bring his people to freedom land. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? George Washington Carver, who was so frail that he was traded for a broken-down horse as a slave boy. And George Washington Carver, sitting in the science laboratory at Tuskegee, told me, he said, Dr. Powell, he said, I just go out in the fields each morning at 5 o'clock, and I let God guide me. And I bring back these little things and work them over my laboratory, and that man did more to revolutionize the agricultural science of peanuts and of cotton and sweet potato than any other human being in the field of agricultural science. What's in your hand? Just let God use you, that's all. What's in your hand? I've got a string in my hand, that's all, and I'm flying a kite. And way up in the heavens, lightning strikes it. And I, Benjamin Franklin, discover for the first time the possibilities of electricity with a string in my hand. What's in your hand? Little hunchback sitting in a Roman jail? I haven't got anything in my hand but an old quill pen, but God says, write what I tell you to write. Paul wrote, I have run my race with patience. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth is laid up for me in the My people are great and big and more numerous than we are. Well, little David, go down to the brook and pick out a few stones and come on back and close your eyes if you want to and pull back that slingshot and let it go. And David killed the biggest enemy, the leader of the giants, against his people, and his people became free, just letting God guide a stone in his hand. And a few years passed, and David is a king. And God says, what's in your hand? He said, I've got a harp in my hand. He said, well, David, play on your harp. And he played, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Leadeth me beside still waters. Yea, though I walk through the valley and the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? Man hanging on a cross. I've got 2 nails in my hand. Father, I stretch my hands to thee. No other help I know. If thou withdraws thyself from me, whither shall I go? And that man, with 2 nails in his hand, split history in half, BC and AD. And what's in your hand tonight, people of Cambridge? You've got God in your hand, and he'll let you win because he's on your side and one with God, always in the majority. So walk with him and talk with him and work with him and stick together and fight together. And with God's hand in your hand, the victory will be accomplished here sooner than you dreamed, sooner than you hoped, sooner than you prayed for, sooner than you imagined. Good night and God bless you.
And it's just one more slide. Sharon, you still there?
Yep,
Okay.
I'm still here. I got you.
Okay. It's the last.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So in the last one, I always, not this one, the one afterwards, I really like, whenever I do presentations or anything, panels, facilitate debates, whatever it is I do, I think it's important that you leave people with something that they can put on the refrigerator. Unfortunately, during COVID, that's not been the case, but I still did a toolbox of citizen power. So the first thing is your ability to read. The ability to read is one of the greatest things that you're able to do, and it doesn't cost money and it's free. Avoid miseducation. That's relying, not letting other people think for you. You think for yourself. You do your own work. The other one is voting, right? Voting is one of the tools. It's not the only tool, but it's a major tool. The other one is Reverend Adam Clayton Powell mentioned, your consumer dollars, where you spend your money, right? You can determine who's going to get your money. If they're not going to respect you, don't give them your money. The other one is civics. Most people know me. I'm a big proponent of civics. I actually teach the American government class, of which they're going to learn everything they need to know. On the left hand, you have the press. The role of the press in the First Amendment was to make sure that the people would know when the other branches of government weren't acting in their stead. And for purposes, I gave a couple of examples of what I consider press. As a matter of fact, they're not only press, real press, but they're also universities of the airways. You could literally get several PhDs from these sources. C-SPAN, of which you're paying for if you have cable. The other one I think is Pacifica stations. The public library. The public library is the only place you can get information, and it's all neutral in terms of reading. A lot of people forget, you go to Google, but Google they have motivations. The more people who go into Google, the more the people who advertise on Google make. The library is a neutral source of information, and you don't have to go to it. You can do and get information virtually. What's not media? What's not press? Media. Whenever you see advertisements, right? CNN, Fox, MSNBC, advertisers, those advertisers paid their salaries. So they're not exactly going to be telling you things against the interests of the people who are advertising because they want to make those salaries. When you talk about C-SPAN, I'm not really sure if their hosts make a lot of money, but they don't have any advertising. And the other thing about C-SPAN is that you get to hear the opinions of people across the political spectrum. They actually invite people who are Republicans, Democrats, independents. As a matter of fact, it was interesting, and I'm gonna get ready to close out. But I was watching C-SPAN because I'm like a C-SPAN junkie. I love C-SPAN. And I noticed they only had call-ins for Democrats and Republicans. And I think I got a little bit of power. I know how to read. I try to avoid miseducation. I vote. I pay attention to where I'm spending my dollars. I know how government works. And I call up and I ask them, I didn't know I was going to get in to the call. I was so surprised. They answered the phone. And I said, you assume that everybody's Democrat or Republican. What about other people? I don't know if it's me or other people call, but I can tell you the next Sunday when I was watching C-SPAN, they had Democrats, people call in who are on the Democratic line, people who call up on the Republican line, and then they had independents. I'm not sure it was me, but I'm just saying we have a lot of power, and you don't even know how much power you have as a citizen of this country until you know you have power. So on that note, I just wanted to leave everybody with this little tip that there's a toolbox of citizen power. Use it. You have so much more power than you think you do. Just use it. And don't forget to vote. Take care. Thank you for the opportunity.
As we are coming close to the end of our time, I don't want to leave the space. I want to thank Linda McDonald Carter. Yes, give her a round of applause for that informative and insightful presentation. Thank you, Linda. I knew you were going to do well. Before we leave, are there any questions? We got 5 minutes for anybody that has a question.
Yes, are there any questions from any of my students?
Yeah, Dr. Carter. Do we still got class after this?
Yes, we do. But are there any questions regarding the presentation? You all know everything.
Awesome.
I thought Mayor Bloomberg paid for the ex-convicts to vote.
Well, we don't like to call them ex-convicts. We're going to talk about people. They're humans. So how about we say people who were formerly incarcerated? Actually, he did pay, but they're challenging his ability to pay. That's a challenge.
Why are they challenging?
Well, keep in mind that if you have all these people who serve time, their interests and who they're going to vote for may be different from the people who don't want them to vote. So I'm glad to see that Bloomberg, of all people, he has the money, that he put the money up, but people are not really, remember I said in this country, we really hold ourselves out as wanting to be a democracy and wanting to encourage people to vote. But when it comes to practical application, that's where the money meets the road. That's where the real deal comes out. Are we really about encouraging people to vote? Or are we about discouraging people to vote? Or is it just certain people we don't want to vote because they may have different interests than those who are in power? So there's something to think about. Any other questions? Sarah, did you want to say something?
No, it was a very nice presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
I have a question.
Okay.
I understand that Bloomberg paid for the formerly incarcerated people their votes, but isn't he a Republican? Like, wouldn't that be like buying the votes for the Republicans?
Well, Bloomberg is, sometimes he's a Democrat, sometimes a Republican. He switches back and forth. Even Trump, sometimes Trump's a Republican, sometimes he's a Democrat. Sometimes he's not either one. So, you know, people can be whatever they want in terms of party. This particular go round, Mayor Bloomberg is a Democrat. I think when he ran for mayor, he was a Republican. So, you know, you don't have to stay with the party. As a matter of fact, Black people in America, after chattel slavery ended, most of them were Republicans. It wasn't until the Great Depression with Franklin Delano Roosevelt that many people start joining the Democratic Party. So, you know, just because you're one thing one day doesn't mean you have to be it like all your life. I have a really good friend of mine who is like a real, not zealous Republican, but now she's an independent, I'm proud to say. You know, she's thinking about, you know, where her vote should go. You know, what are they doing for her community? That determines who she's going to vote for. What are you doing for the community? For me, it's a little different. I don't think I should probably reveal what I am, other than say that I'm not Democrat or Republican. I see them as two wings on the same bird. Any questions, John? I'm looking for John to say something. John? John doesn't have anything to say. That's unusual.
No, it's my mic unmuted.
Oh.
Honestly, no, that was a very good presentation. Like, I really liked it.
John and Sarah liked it. Oh my God.
Yeah, but something that surprised me was the whole poll tax thing of how it wasn't rescinded until 1964. That's still pretty recent.
Well, actually, in Florida, that's the point that I think Sarah or somebody made. In Florida today, the fact that somebody's trying to pay off the fines that people have so that they can vote. We still have poll taxes in America in 2020, almost 2021. Remember, this whole thing is if you don't want to have certain people to participate in the process, you do whatever it takes to keep them from voting. And so the sad part is there's so many people who don't vote. They don't have to know, they know how to read already. You know, they have everything's required. They don't have to go through the things that other people have gone through. For me, you know, it's always been really important, as I said, because when I was 18, I was in the first group of 18-year-olds to be able to vote. And I have never missed an election since 1972, no matter what level it was. I think even if I were in the hospital, somebody would get me to the polls some way.
But also, one more thing. This is something that I learned. I'm not sure if it's 100% true, so take it with a grain of salt. But I've heard the whole that pictures of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X from that original civil rights movement in the 60s, that they are purposefully shown in black and white to try to create a disconnect of trying to make it feel longer ago than it really was. Like all those pictures that you find, I believe you can just find them in color, actually.
You know, John, this is the first time I've heard that. But
because they had at the time they had color TV, color photography. So they just wonder why are all those pictures in black and white? I believe it's done intentionally to create a large disconnect. Because they try to paint it as like, oh, it was so long ago, but for most people they could just ask their grandparents what it was like.
Well, you know what?
They were alive.
You raise an interesting point. I've never heard that before. So I want you to go and verify that and bring it to the next class, because I think that's interesting, especially when you have so many people who don't know the history of the United States. And half the problems we have here, one, people don't know civics. So they don't know how to make their elected officials accountable to them. That's the problem. And the other part is the fact that people don't like history. And I tend to think that people don't like history because the way it's taught is sort of taught in a way, not that people purposely do it, but for what I understand, speaking to students, it sort of discourages people from wanting to know. The people that they talk about don't tend to, in the minds of young people, have any relevance to their life, when in fact they do. So I was just in love with history. I just loved history, maybe because I could trace my father's family back to the late 1600s in this country. Maybe that's the reason why. Maybe because it's so difficult to trace my mother's family, because my great-great-grandmother was a migrant Indian. So there were no papers on her, but on my father's side, there were a lot of papers, so it's easier to trace. So for me, I always loved history, but it didn't matter how it was taught. But for some people, if it's not taught a certain way, they have no interest, and they remember things, take a test, and then when the test is over, they think it has no relevance. Listen, we all have a history. From the day you were born, your history started. Anything you've done along the way, your parents' history is part of your history. Your grandparents' history is part of your history. History is, we all have history. We're making history right now. You have a history in this class from the time you walked in at 6:40 or came on the Zoom at 6:40 up to now. You have a history. Just the history of being here for this presentation from this time backwards is a history. So every minute forward is part of your history. It never goes away. It's always following you.
Professor?
Yes?
May I ask one more question?
Yes, you may.
Which is actually half comment, half question. You mentioned literacy, and they didn't allow people that didn't know how to read, how to vote. And in my humble opinion, these ballots are very complicated for the regular citizen to understand. I never saw anything so complex. It's like a map, and it's so many squares. I don't know what to do. It's confusing for me. Just letting you know.
You make a good point, because again, if we were serious in this country in terms of being a democracy, if we really wanted to encourage and foster voter participation, it's in my mind, when you're born in this country, you should automatically be registered to vote. I will tell you that I believe in Vermont and New Hampshire. I'm not sure it's New Hampshire, I just don't remember right now. Remember Vermont? They don't go through all these changes, but you have to realize that those are two of the whitest states, right? They don't have a history of chattel slavery. So remember, at the root of this country and how the dynamics of this country, whether it's the economy, the history, and a host of other things, slavery or chattel slavery is at the root of it. So when you talk about voting, you talk about the criminal justice, there's nothing, the economy, nothing you could talk about in this country where the roots do not go back to the dynamics of chattel slavery. So in answer to your question, you're absolutely right, because if we wanted people to vote and make it easy for them, you wouldn't have to look at a document and you feel like it's a math test. So I totally agree with you. Anyone else have any questions before we leave and go back so we can hear a presentation?
I have this question. If I do look into the whole thing about the black and white or color photographs, do I get extra credit?
Sure, John, you can get extra credit. That's 1 of 4, okay? Remember, in order to get a plus, you need 4, unless you go to 2 of the main. I'm having 2 extra credit. One's tomorrow with the New Jersey State Bar Association, and next week is one with the Latino Empowerment. And those, if you go to, you don't have to do 4. That one in and of itself, because it's so long, it would count for a plus. So if you were to get a C, you would automatically get a C plus. If you got a C plus, you would get a B minus. Okay.
So to actually
to all 4.
So let's talk about the grades and stuff when we leave the presentation, because I think we're still being taped. Sharon?
I didn't get the Bar Association.
New Jersey State Bar Association.
No, I didn't get that, just the Latina. And I can't because it's Monday or Wednesday. I have class. But the Bar Association, I didn't get it. And tomorrow is good for me. I can do it.
Right. And you have to register. It's all day. Garfield, make sure you put that in the chat.
All right, I will. That's for the legal.
Tomorrow. They need to register tonight.
I'm going to put it in Moodle.
Right. Now, keep in mind, guys, if you're going to come tomorrow, excuse me, it's free, but you just have to register as a law student. Okay? I made arrangements so that my students, if they register as a law student, it doesn't cost them anything and they can participate. Sharon, are you still there?
I'm still here, and I want to thank your students for participating in the conversation. But to add to their extra credit conversation, I will send over some invitations to some upcoming events. I'll send them over to Professor Carter that they can attend as well. So there are some other things that are going on. So that way you can be engaged in this particular process. Thank you. Yes,
I would just say before we close out, I tell my students that this area, when you talk about politics in particular and government, there's a whole lot of money to be made in this area. And if you're watching all these commercials, people organizing people to get out to vote, there's so much money in this area. So I'm trying to encourage the students in this class to consider this as a profession. It's not a 9-to-5 job. No. You're going to be on the road. You're going to meet a lot of people. You work on teams. You work by yourself. And just to give a quick example, which I may have done already, in 1980, when I worked for United States Bill Bradley, first of all, I just wanted to tell you that Bill Bradley, actually, I was referred to Bill Bradley by the mayor of the city of Newark, who was the first person to support him. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing, so we'll just ignore it. He was the first to support Bill Bradley, who was, he was a Knicks player and he was also a Rhodes Scholar. I was asked to work for Bill Bradley because of, actually being in touch with people that, you want to put yourself out there, let people know you're out there, what you can do. And so I worked for, that distracted me, obviously. I worked for, she won't give up. I worked for Bill Bradley and I forgot what I was going to say because, oh, I know what it was. I met a young man, he went to King College, either King or William-Patterson. And when he came out, he started working on campaigns. He was just like volunteering on campaigns and things of that sort, doing surveys or things of that sort. And he actually ended up working on campaigns. And his first year out of college, he made, in 1983, he made $250,000 straight out of college.
Wow.
working on campaigns. But it wasn't like he was, pushing a clock or anything like that. He had to be open to meeting people. You had to be open to meeting people, taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves, be flexible, and just be willing to fly around the country working on campaign. He may work on a campaign in Omaha one day or for a month, and then work on another campaign in Kansas or work in Texas or California. So there's so much money to be made in this area off of taxpayers. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point because many of the people in this class, I'm hoping that they consider that opportunity to make.
So the last thing,
themselves.
awesome. The last thing that I will say though, Linda, on November 5th, we are doing a panel presentation of young professionals who completed their undergraduate and graduate degree in SPA, but all of them are in politics. And I believe most of the panel is under the age of 30. So they came out Rutgers completing their degree and became involved in politics right away and have really made some major strides. So I will send the information over to share with the students so they get a chance to talk to somebody that looks like them in the same age group as them, but heavily involved in this political dynamic.
Are you suggesting that I'm not the same age as my students? I know I can outrun all of my students. The only people I can't outrun is the track team for Essex County College, who at one point could beat Yale, and we don't even have a place to practice. And Yale has more money than country. So I can't beat our track team, but I can beat all these students running. The only thing is I can't beat the track team walking because I do a 10-minute mile walk.
So on behalf of the School of Public Affairs and Administration, our faculty, staff, and students, Linda McDonald Carter, thank you. Students, have a great evening. Thank you for attending and participating. And hopefully we'll see you soon over at Rutgers University Newark in the SPA family.